Hi, welcome everyone. For those of you who are still getting food, please feel free to continue and take your seats, but we're going to get started. I'm Rachel Goldbrenner, Executive Director of the Reese Center on Law and Security here at the Law School. Thank you for being here today for this conversation on national security and the rise of populism, featuring Ambassador Karen Pierce and author Yascha Mounk. There are many friends and affiliates of the center in the room today, but I want to take a moment to especially recognize our center's namesake, Rick Reese. Thank you, Rick, for your leadership and your support. When our center relaunched this past fall with a renewed agenda and an incredible new cohort of fellows, including Yascha, we pledged to take up the most urgent national security challenges of this moment. Prominent among those in our minds was rising nationalism and populism around the world and the ways that trend will impact longstanding security alliances, multilateral institutions, and even the stability and durability of democracy itself. All core concerns for students and practitioners of national security law and policy. So I'm especially grateful to our fantastic speakers for being here today to dive into this with us. And now it is my honor to introduce them. Dame Karen Pierce has served as the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations since March 2018. She is the first woman to serve in this role. Ambassador Pierce previously served as the Director General for Political Affairs and Chief Operating Officer of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. She first joined the FCO in 1981. Among many other roles, she served as UK Ambassador to Afghanistan and as UK Ambassador to the UN, WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva. We're honored to have her with us today and to be able to draw from her wealth of experience. Yascha Mounk is a leading expert on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. He is a senior fellow with our Reese Center. He's also an associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University. Yascha's latest book is The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. It explains the causes of the populist rise and investigates how to renew liberal democracy. It's been translated into 10 languages and was hailed as one of the best books of 2018. Thank you both so much for being with us today, and I will now turn it over to Yascha.
Great. Well, thank you very much to you and Vicente, and thank you to the ambassador for making time. And what I take it is a very relaxed day when nothing is going on at the UN or in Washington, D.C. So since we're at a university, I never studied international relations, but my basic understanding of international relations is that there's this 70-year ongoing debate in political science about whether countries always do the same irrespective of who governs them, or whether the ideas and ideologies of the people who govern them are hugely influential on what they do. I'm caricaturing ever so slightly. In your experience at the UN and in other important posts you've had, where would you fall in that debate, specifically with regard to populism? Do you feel that in those countries where populists have been elected over the last 5 or 10 years, your daily dealings with them have changed, their posture on the international stage has changed, or by and large, despite some visible statements and so on, have these countries basically continued to act in the same way?
Well, thank you very much, Yascha. I didn't study international relations either, so hopefully we can find some common ground. I think there is such a thing as national character. I think if you're British, you really feel that. And for anyone who's not read it, but who is a student of these things, there's a fascinating book published for American servicemen who were stationed in England in the Second World War, telling them how to deal with Brits. And it says things like, Britain is a very small, crowded island, so everyone is very polite. So I think there are some enduring characteristics. And
I read a wonderful account recently of Erasmus coming to Britain and complaining that everybody is so loud and hugs and kisses you all the time. So there's been some change in the last 500 years.
But I think what you get with populism is a distortion of those national characteristics at one extreme or the other. But some of what you see in Britain that led to Brexit, you can actually see echoes of under Gladstone. So that I mentioned that just to stand at my basic point, that in many ways populism is a distortion of something that's probably already there. But I think the reason it makes things so hard for us at the moment is that it's almost respectable to be populist, or at least it doesn't provoke the outrage that I remember it doing last time Europe went through this sort of wave of populism. And I was talking to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, about this the other day, because he used to be Prime Minister of Portugal. So he's got a lot of experience of European politics. And I don't know if anyone in the room remembers Chancellor Haidar of Austria. But when he was elected, his politics were deemed to be so awful that the European Union went through various measures to have nothing to do with him. And some people in the European Union even tried to expel Austria at that time. That was what I would think was a principled, moral response to repugnancy at a series of populist policies. Now, of course, you have a situation where Marine Le Pen nearly got elected in France. You have the situation in Italy. You have Hungary. And, of course, you have the situation in the UK. And in America, too, you have all these movements whereby saying things that used to be unsayable becomes tolerable. And that's not a free speech issue. That's about where do you draw the line between what's hateful and what's not.
So what impact do you think this is actually going to have on international relations? And we'll get to sort of national security more specifically later. But when people like Donald Trump were elected, there was a lot of concern that NATO would fall apart, that the very nature of international relations was going to change very quickly. And I probably was guilty of having some of those worries and writing about them. I think it's, if you want to play devil's advocate, you could say, well, actually, over the last 2 or 3 years, not that many things have changed. These institutions still exist. NATO is still around. We're having some live coverage from the release of the Mueller report over there. NATO is still around. The EU, well, the United Kingdom may or may not choose to ultimately exit the United Kingdom, but the EU itself actually looks in some ways more stable than it did 2 or 3 years ago. So where do you see the danger of this populist rise beyond just the moral odiousness of some of the things that populists say?
I think one principal area where you find it is in trade. If I worried about one long-term trend across the international system, it would be the effect of populism on trade. And that certainly does have a historical bent to it. I think anyone who deals with trade, I was the trade ambassador in Geneva, trade is very counterintuitive for the average person who lives in an average community in any country, because you're fundamentally saying, let in competition, because ultimately that will be good for ordinary citizens. And they see factories close, etc. And that debate about globalization you have echoes of today. So I think that's the biggest danger from populism, that it makes keeping an open liberal trading system right the way around the world much harder. You do see echoes of it here. President Trump talks about Make America Great Again in the context of economic resurgence, as well as some of his other ideas. And I don't mean by this what the president says about China and trade. I think the president makes a very valid point about China. China, a little bit like Japan before her in a different era, does buck the international trading system. But it's more the principles of free trade are being undermined by populism. I think that's one point. And I think the second point means that people no longer automatically accept the version of events given to them by authoritative sources, whether the authoritative sources are a government, an international institution like NATO, the BBC. People feel much more under threat or compelled to challenge the very basis of fact. And then I think you get to a stage where discourse becomes very difficult, and politicians start to reflect their base rather than trying to compromise in acts of statesmanship to move things forward. And I think that you see particularly. And an Italian politician told me that the effect of the coalition in Italy is actually that each extremist wing, if you like, talks the other one up. And then you get to policies that are very hard to ameliorate or find a way through. So I come back to the point about distortion.
So trade, I think, is very important. But again, if I was trying to put my skeptic's hat on, I might say, well, you know, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a lot of bluster about trade, certainly from the United States and also from some other countries. But in the end, when you look at cross-border trade, it has only continued to increase in the last years. We haven't seen an imminent collapse of a trading order. There's a few silly punitive tariffs going back and forth between certain countries, but it hasn't actually done any major economic damage so far. So I guess one way of thinking about this is either to say that perhaps all of these populists aren't as damaging to our ability to cooperate internationally, including on trade, as we thought, or that this is only the early stages of what's going to happen, that you need to see them entrench their power more within the countries they rule, or perhaps you know, a large enough number of populists taking over different countries before we really see the corrosive impact. So help me understand, is it that actually things are worse at the moment than I just made them out to be? Is it that the worst is yet to come? Why should we be so concerned about trade?
I'm not a student of populism or politics in that sense, so there'll be people in this room who are far more expert than me. But I think from the point of view of international relations, things tend to go in waves. And we're clearly, as you say, in a wave of populism rather than a wave of internationalism. But the effect that can have on the ground is a kind of every man for himself, dog-eat-dog approach to cooperation and to alliances. So if I can take the example of Syria, in northeast Syria, you see the Turks making very national security choices over and above their long-standing strategic interest in supporting the NATO alliance. And I don't mean that to criticize the Turks. I mean that perhaps 10 years ago, Turkey would have made a different set of assumptions about her overall security interests. So I do worry that some of the criticism of international institutions feeds this sense of dog-eat-dog, everyone for themselves, and starts to make alliances harder to hang together. And ultimately, if you don't have faith in a collective security system, it's not a hard step from there to thinking that your security depends on someone else being insecure as opposed to a win-win security situation.
So you just came from Midtown, you're going back to Midtown after this event. Do you see this in your daily work at the UN, that countries which are long-standing allies of the United Kingdom, suddenly it's much more difficult to work with them, that perhaps they have a lot more sympathy for Russia and China than we do for the positions of the United Kingdom? Is this something that actually comes up in your day-to-day work? Or is it, again, more of a prospective worry about what would happen if that kind of sentiment takes over?
I think there are two aspects to the first part of your question, which I think are a little bit different, but they end up being very similar. We, certainly as the United Kingdom, and I think most Western countries that have been around for a while, so let's say the founding members of the United Nations, certainly we have to work harder at our alliances and our interests in the UN than we had to even 10 years ago when I was last here. And some of the reason for that is wholly good. It's because there are more countries reaching a level of economic and political maturity, coming onto the world stage, wanting their say in international organisations. And fundamentally, that's a good thing if we can manage to preserve the rules-based international system, to use the jargon, that on the whole has kept the world secure and prosperous. I think that's a different impulse from what is happening with Russia and China. I think one of the reasons for the rise of populism and why it's taking root so much, if I may say so, is that the absence of a visible American leadership is leading a number of countries to reinsure with the likes of China and Russia. And this is happening at a time when China and Russia are ready to receive that approach, because you have a more aggressive Russia, a more assertive China, and China particularly is using Belt and Road and economic provisions to pull people into her camp.
So I wonder whether that's exactly right, because when you look at a country like, say, Italy, they actually quite like the current President of the United States. They don't think that he is in some ways failing to lead, and some of their attraction to a country like Russia is quite ideological as well. They actually like the more authoritarian style of government in the country, and I think they like some of the policies, including, you know, being very harsh on immigrants and hostile to Muslims to a certain extent, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I wonder whether there aren't countries that are part of NATO and that are part of the Western Alliance and that are traditional allies of the United Kingdom that actually do start to have a rapprochement with countries like Russia, because they generally find things to admire there. And that might be quite independent of what the United States does. In fact, some of the figures in the United States who, on a sort of from the values that the two of us probably share, we feel like they're not quite doing the type of leadership we'd be hoping for, may be more sympathetic to them and may actually slow the turn that some of those longtime allies are affecting towards Russia.
I think that's quite a hard question. I think there's probably something deeply unpleasant about some of the attachments to Russia at the moment that stem from the visible power of Putin the person, that stem from the white Russia, to be really blunt about it, that stem from Putin's attachment to Christianity, particularly Orthodox Christianity. It's a very limiting philosophy and outlook. And I think you're right. Some people find that strongman approach aligned to those particular things attractive and even comforting. I don't think that springs from very nice motives, to be absolutely honest. But as far as Italy goes, or the European Union goes, when you come to the United Nations, on the whole, the European Union at the moment tends to represent the most liberal of the groups in the UN, arguing for what might be thought of as progressive liberal values. So I don't think within Europe it does have a big material effect, but I do worry about trade. At the UN, I'm thinking more of countries who are recently coming onto the international stage. And I think there is a fear that the implicit American guarantee that has been around since 1945 will not be there anymore. And therefore, they reinsure. And economically, the West isn't terribly good at the moment at funding, say, infrastructure in Africa. So the only country that those African countries who want big investment can turn to is China. They then get in debt to quite a very serious extent with China, and then you get a different set of problems. But the West hasn't got an alternative source of money for them at the moment. And I actually think the President commissioned a study into this, the fact that the West does not have very good mechanisms for helping countries deal with big infrastructure projects.
Well, what does all of this do to the ability to have long-term cooperation? So just as an example, there's a debate about a potential European army, and I always wonder whether in the context of a European army, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 might not make 7 or 8, as the hope is, that if each country specializes a little bit and you have an ability to work together, then the money of each country goes a lot further in defense. But that it might actually, in this case, 1 + 1 + 1 might make 0, because if suddenly there are members of the alliance that say, well, no, actually we're not willing to use our material for this particular foreign policy goal, because we now have a government that actually is very sympathetic to Russia or to China in some kind of conflict, then you may be stuck not being able to do very much. Now, that's one specific problem around some ideas within the European Union on a European army, but there's much broader applicability of that question, which is, you now need to think about, can I trust certain governments in terms of supporting our foreign policy goals within the alliance? But then there's a second question about, can I trust a country, say, and I don't mean to single it out, like France, which currently has a government which, I presume from the perspective of Britain is in certain ways easy to deal with around some of these national security things, but you don't know who's going to be president in 2022. So how can you have certain forms of long-term cooperation when you have a threat of somebody like Marine Le Pen potentially, eventually, sitting in the Élysée Palace? So does that influence sort of long-term strategic planning at all? Is that something where you just have to say, if that black swan comes around the corner, it will, but we can't think about it now? How does that reshape long-term thinking around national security?
I think one needn't worry excessively about that. NATO particularly, but also the European Union, are built on a commonality, not just of policies, but of values and ideas. And even if the politics in a country changes, as you said earlier, NATO is still with us, the EU is still with us, the rate of change in those organisations, if it happens at all, will be on a slow burn. But NATO and the EU deal with a very particular part of the world. And this is why I use the northeastern Syria example. In a different part of the world, different rules are looking like they apply. And I think that is where 10 years ago, as I say, someone like Turkey would have looked at northeast Syria through a very large lens of their NATO equities, particularly with the United States. And now they look at it in rather a different way.
Interesting. There's a sort of converse way of thinking about this. We tend to think about the ability of Western countries to cooperate on national security and so on. There's also an inverse question about the ability of populist governments to work effectively together. And I think in many cases populists haven't yet quite figured out whether they want to take down international institutions. Do they want to abolish the EU if they get the ability to do that? Do they want to get rid of the UN? Or do they actually want to take those institutions over and to some extent remodel them in their own image? So what do you think, and what's your experience at the UN on the ability of countries ruled by populists to actually work together effectively? Is there something like a nationalist international in practice? Or is that something that works as long as they're in opposition and they can hate on some of the same people, but once they're actually sitting in that chair, they have all the same conflicts as other countries and they're not actually able to work together effectively?
I don't think you see a problem on the security side because either you have your alliances and they're held up, or you have your own national security interests, and there's nothing axiomatic that says populist A will have the same national security interests as populist B. But where I think there is a problem is on the values agenda. If you look at the work that the UN has been doing recently, particularly on the status of women, particularly on LGBTQ, particularly on what in the UN is called sexual rights and reproductive rights, then yes, driven by their populist movements, you will have an alliance sitting in the UN negotiating room between the United States of America, Russia, the Holy See, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. So on those issues, yes, I think that is pernicious, to be honest, because what it's trying to do is not merely prevent progress. That would be in many ways a legitimate thing to say, we do not subscribe to advancing these policies. What they're trying to do is roll back what we call the normative framework around the world, on which things like the World Health Organization base their policies, development assistance is given, developing countries base their public policy. That, I think, is where you get a real material effect that has the potential to disrupt the lives of ordinary citizens around the world.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of discussion about the relationship of populist governments to Russia. I think we haven't really debated as much their relationship to China, and I think that's in part because they haven't quite figured out what the stance towards China is. Do you have a sense of, is there sort of an emerging consensus in these countries of what they think about China? I was just in Trieste for a BBC radio program on the day, coincidentally, where they announced that the port of Trieste was being sold off to China. So the Italian government, at least, seems to be willing to cooperate with China. For you could also imagine some of that populist energy turning against China in a pretty serious way and potentially actually making it easier to find a kind of pan-Western response to the rise of China. So what is the stance of some of these populist governments on China and the day-to-day work at the UN? And do you think in the long run, populism is going to pose a real problem in our ability to manage China's rise because it'll split the West, or might it actually help us sort of become aware of some of the challenges around it?
I'll start with Russia. I think the first thing to say about Russia is that I think Kissinger is right to think of Russia in overstretch and in decline, particularly because of the economy. There is a well-founded suspicion that she funds certain populist movements, and I think it's more populist movements distorting national politics than particularly populist governments, because certainly in the West, a lot of what you do as a government is constrained by the way the world works. So I think it's a very different case from China. I think China has a very strong economic imperative. We all know the size of the Chinese economy. The way they prosecute economic advantage is very important to them. And they will ameliorate some of their short-term demands for their economic advancement, in my experience. China taking over something iconic like the port of Trieste, the Waldorf Astoria, various things in the UK. Yes, it does arouse some quite strong feelings in people, but fundamentally, it's whether or not China abides by the normal rules of such things that determines whether or not that's a problem. So when China set up the Asian Investment Bank, the American government was very keen to lobby to try and stop countries giving money to that bank and working with China. We in Britain took a different view. We said the most important thing is that when that bank is lending money, it's doing so based on the rules of the international financial system that we are all comfortable with, understand, and which actually help developing countries. So the rules matter more than the origin. And actually the Chinese did set the AIIB up on that normative basis, which is interesting. There's a BRICS bank that's not set up on that basis. So I think that's the distinguisher. That's where, to the extent that we argue with what they do, we should concentrate on the organizations and the instruments they have that are at odds with the prevailing normative international framework.
I mean, Russia in many ways presents itself quite proudly. They wouldn't quite put it in those terms, I'm sure, but there is a sort of slightly trollish feel, not just to some of the Twitter accounts that the foreign ministry runs, but also to some of their policies. They want to be a spanner in the works and just proudly sort of complicate things for the West in whatever way they can, wherever they can. China has chosen to present itself in a rather different way. Mm-hmm. And there was this sort of really quite striking moment at Davos where President Xi came there and said, well, I am now the upholder of the international liberal order. How serious do you take that difference? Is that a difference in PR, or is that a real difference in how those countries perceive the world and what kind of international order they would like to put in place?
I think there's a really fundamental difference between Russia and China for two reasons. One is on the decline and one is on the up, and the size of the economies just underscores that. But also for the reasons you said, Yasha, Russia is a disruptor, she's a spoiler, she wants to stop things happen. She wants to slow the international system down almost to absolute freezing point, so that it moves a little. It's the only show in town, Russia controls it, but it doesn't actually get up and do something, particularly anything that might contest Russia's view of the world. This often marks out her position in the Security Council. China has a different approach. China believes in multilateralism to the extent that it can use that to advance its bilateral economic interests. But China also does support the UN in very practical ways when there isn't necessarily a direct material benefit for China's economy. And so to that extent, they're very different. A number of countries will tell you privately that the way China goes about lending them money is close to blackmail. Nevertheless, because there aren't many other ways that these countries can get money for their bridges and their railways and their roads, it will carry on feeding that relationship with China. And China has been very good at saying to countries, well, you know, if you borrow from us, we don't worry about all these human rights issues you might have. We don't worry about good governance. Here's the check. We're your friends. And that's quite seductive for some governments.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask one snarky question about Britain and Brexit.
Feel free, because everyone else does. So
yeah, I'm sure you have your standard
fine.
answer, so you can just sort of press play. But you know, I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, if I'd been asked to name one country in the world, one democracy in the world, where both I felt that the political institutions were incredibly stable, and that it was generally a very well-governed country with an extremely expert civil service, rather than random rich people being appointed ambassadors, with you know, a deep respect for you know, all the kinds of things that we admire in democracies, I would probably have named the United Kingdom. I'm not sure that the United Kingdom would be my first choice right now, and I think a lot of Britain's allies have been deeply frustrated, not just by the particular choice that the population has made in a referendum, but by the utter chaos that has followed. You know, I guess two questions. Like, one, what do you say to colleagues who ask, have you guys all gone mad? What is going on there? Can we rely on you? But more broadly, you know, does it show that we sort of assume that there's a certain point, a safety valve, at which rationality will kick in? And that may actually be wrong. But if a country like the UK can be in such political chaos right now, that can happen everywhere, and pretty bad outcomes can happen, like, say, no deal Brexit, that nobody really intends because of these vast failures of collective action, even in some of the supposedly most functional political systems in the world. And isn't that pretty scary in terms of implications on all kinds of things, from, you know, warfare to et cetera, et cetera? So, small question.
Well, we just got tired of having a national character set in stone in 1800 years ago and never changing, and we thought we'd be a bit more exciting for a change. Like I said earlier, countries go through periodic cycles, and the popular movement that led to the referendum being narrowly in favour of Brexit was, I think, one of those cycles. But I would stress that the margin for Brexit was about 4%. And this is actually laying at the heart of all the subsequent difficulties in finding the model for Britain's future relationship with the EU. And the other factor in that has been that both sides of the political divide, there are Remainers and there are Brexiteers. And as an interesting fact for those of you who like political psychology, when we mapped the Brexit vote onto the way people thought, it wasn't old versus young, it wasn't Labour versus Tory, it wasn't North versus South, it was a values mapping, so that if you believed in capital punishment, say, you believed in leaving the EU. So it's absolutely values driven, going to the heart of how people, as you said earlier, see themselves in society. But nobody should be in any doubt, and if there are any Russians in the audience, please report this back. Nobody should be in any doubt that Britain still retains all its capabilities and all its interests in being an active, independent force, hopefully for good, on the world stage and at the UN. And obviously we're very conscious in my mission that how we behave at the UN after we leave the European Union will be a very important signifier to the rest of the world of what sort of country is Britain. The Brexit wrangling, for want of a better word, will start to coalesce soon into a plan. The European Union have given Britain more space. So if we agree a plan before 22 May, we leave straight away and don't take part in the European elections. If we haven't agreed it by 22 May, we remain a member of the European Union, which means take part in the elections through to the end of October. And what's happening now is that the government is talking to the opposition about what that plan might look like so that it can command a majority in Parliament. The problem so far has been that no single version of the plan has commanded a parliamentary majority because of this 4% is not really a broad enough majority on which to conclude any particular implications of constitutional change. And that's been our problem. Now, some people might say we should have done this before, and that would be a perfectly valid criticism, but it's very much an internal British thing. It hasn't stopped us having troops in Afghanistan. It hasn't stopped us engaging on Syria or Iran. It hasn't stopped our trading relationships, and it hasn't stopped us trying to advance the public policy agenda at places like the UN.
Thank you very much. I think we have a good amount of time for questions. There's some microphones in the back if you position yourself to the left or the right. I would like to ask all of you to keep your questions to 30 seconds or less. Otherwise, I will start to nervously make noises into my microphone. And questions have the distinguishing feature that they have a question mark at the end rather than an exclamation mark. Please, the gentleman on the left.
Yes, I thought the topic here was national security and the rise of populism. And I don't know that I've really heard much discussion about the connection of those two things. And in that regard, I wonder whether, and also I haven't heard much discussion about the cause of populism. And I wonder whether there might be, and I'm thinking of a report I just heard of a discussion of Jimmy Carter, President Carter, discussion with President Trump a couple of days ago about the rise in popularity of China really compared to the West.
I haven't yet heard a question mark, and I think 30 seconds are about up, so you have 10 seconds to ask a question.
My question is whether part of the populist instinct might be a rebellion against militarism and excessive military spending by the United States and Great Britain in priority to basic human needs that people might have. That was the Jimmy Carter
I think we get the question.
explanation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
I don't think that there will always be some groups who protest against military spending, but you don't see the huge demonstrations in the West that you saw against Vietnam, for example, or against nuclear submarines and nuclear weapons that you saw in C&D, Bertrand Russell, all of that in the United Kingdom. So I don't actually think there's a very strong link between the two things. But I do think that one of the features of populism is isolationism, and money should be spent at home. And for some people, that means aid shouldn't be spent on foreigners, it should be spent on hospitals at home. And for other people, it means you shouldn't enter into military alliances, everyone should keep to themselves. But I don't detect that there's one overriding theme throughout the populist movements related to national security. I think there's an interesting question for Iran at the moment, because the floods in Iran are bringing home to the Iranian people that the Revolutionary Guards have been off on adventures abroad, spending the country's money. And this is a good lesson for the Iranian people to learn. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, having spotted the problem, have now made sure that they're at the forefront of the relief effort. So there is some link, but I don't think it's as decisive as your question implied.
The lady on the right.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Carol Lynn Steiner. I am curious why we try to make nice to this movement and call it populist when there's nothing popular about communism. And why not use the term that it is? because it is a tremendous danger to the world and to our country. And as opposed to the program saying that your book also looks to renew liberal democracy, why not say to save the republic? America is a republic, and it's the danger, as former President Gorbachev would tell anybody, is its failure. It's a failure movement, and yet these people will wait for decades, absolute decades. So I'm curious, why? Why say populist? There's nothing popular about
sure.
it, if not to make it sound nice.
All right. Would you like to speak to that? I can say a little bit about it as well.
All I'd say is that popular, however, whatever you call it, nationalism, whatever, it's right wing as well as left wing, and that's part of the point. And I think we've always known that eventually that horseshoe almost joins up in some of the policies between the extreme right and the extreme left. I think we also know that countries that run themselves like that, you're quite right, they don't thrive. They might thrive over the short term, they won't thrive over the long term. But it's very hard to get that message across sometimes, which is why I started with trade. I really worry that the trading argument gets lost in all the nationalism.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. There's a nice story going around for whose accuracy I can't vouch, that when Steve Bannon first had a meeting with Donald Trump and tried to sell him on being a coherent populist, something he's never quite achieved, I think, Trump said, "Oh, I want to be a popularist. I want to get all the votes I can get." So there is something puzzling about the word populist, that it's so close to popularist. And of course, in a democracy, trying to be popular is in itself a good thing. But I think the nature of populism goes beyond that. The way in which I use the term is to talk about politicians who say that they and they alone truly represent the people. And the problem with that is that it implicitly makes anybody who disagrees with them illegitimate. So that if you disagree with them, if you're not part of a movement, then you're a traitor, an enemy of the people, and so on and so forth. And that means that once they're in government, they tend to extend and expand the power they have. At first, that can be popular because they can cut through certain gridlock and so on, but over time, it means that they become actually less and less responsive to ordinary people. So when I say the people versus democracy, which is the title of my book, what I mean to pick out is precisely this tendency of populists to say, I stand for the people, but in the end, they become unaccountable to the people. It becomes impossible to remove them through democratic means. The gentleman on the left.
Sorry, can I just add, excuse me, would you mind if I just added
Please.
one sentence to that? I think the other effect, as well as the ones Yasha was describing, that it inhibits acts of statesmanship. It inhibits people doing something for a good further down the road that may be harder to define, but that history would show was the right thing to do.
Excuse me, I'll just say that we who believe in freedom must use the right terms and not make nice to anything that's in our danger.
Sure, and part of freedom is that we can have legitimate disagreements about what the right terms are. The gentleman on the left.
Well, thank you. My term may be a little different. When do we use the term neo-fascism to discuss what's going on? Because if we look at every situation, particularly in Europe, someone like Marine Le Pen, we know her genealogy from her father, who was an outright defender of neo-Nazism in the Vichy France. So when do we get to the point where we start trying to theorize this or understand it for what it is based on the compositions politically in each society we see who support this? You mentioned Bannon. Bannon's like a Pied Piper running around Europe acting to try to create a neo-fascist Comintern, if you will. And I use that term straight up because populism does not deal with that. Secondly, the question of the class.
One question.
My
no,
30
we got your
seconds
question,
still on, baby.
Ambassador. I'm keeping to 30 seconds for this is my one rule.
I want to finish this comment about the class compositions. In this society, in America, for example, these issues have been going on since '64, after the Goldwater election and defeat. And we can see that the white working class and low middle class, parts of them, have been attracted to these concepts and ideas for decades, as in Europe. Why is this not interrogated in the issue of populism, in quotes, and seen as a potential for a national security threat? Because we're now seeing it manifested in xenophobia in America and in Europe.
We got the question, Ambassador.
Well, I think, it's a very big subject, and we've only got a limited time here, and we're trying to cope with both left-wing and right-wing extremism and every variety in between. So I don't think you should construe that we don't take very seriously the neo-Nazi, neo-fascist part of this. It's just very hard to put a definition on it. But you're right about marginalised groups, and you're right about poor white people. And in the UK, for example, we found that the groups that did worse at school now were poor white boys. So at one level, it's very hard to identify specific measures when you get into what you might think of as a traditional mainstream group. I think the other factor worth mentioning, people like the World Economic Forum and the UN have mapped what are called inequalities, meaning that the people who earn a lot of money in a country now earn exponentially X times more than the people who are the poorest. Now, that's not an American concept. I completely get that. America was built on a philosophy of economic liberalism and competition, and that's fantastic. But a lot of other countries don't have that tradition, and therefore are not very good at coping with these enormous inequities.
Just to add one or two thoughts to that very quickly, I think one of the differences between fascism and right-wing populism is that fascists were often quite openly hostile to democracy, and that they wanted to erect totalitarian societies, ones which were deeply politicized. And I think what populists often do in the first instance is that they claim to be more democratic than the existing order, which makes them much more dangerous, because I think if people were openly saying, I want to abolish democracy, they wouldn't have that much support. But to claim that they truly speak for the people and against the unaccountable elites and come into office in that way and then chip away at all of these independent institutions is actually a much greater danger. And then the second distinction is around the totalitarian nature. We haven't so far seen populists elected in democracies build a totalitarian society. They're quite happy if people are not interested in politics, so they switch off and just say, that guy is in there and he can look out for our interests and we can forget about politics. So I think the nature of a movement is importantly different, and we don't understand why it's so dangerous if we don't understand how it's different from fascism. The gentleman on the right for 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, Madam Ambassador. I'm Albert Golson. Populism has grown quite rapidly over the last 10, 15 years on the background of economic growth. What will happen? What are the dynamics? What are the real dangers when the global economy starts to slow down and then we go into a recession? What are the trigger points? What are the dangers that we face?
I think you're right to highlight the economics. What I haven't done and haven't read about is how far populism might have been accelerated by the 2008 financial crash. So I'm not enough of an expert in how it developed to give you a proper answer. But certainly, one of the problems is that governments in the West have not invested fast enough or deeply enough to get ahead of the curve of changing economies. So globalization sucked a lot of production out of Western Europe and America. When there's a recession, that pie is obviously smaller. Are governments doing enough to know how to stay competitive, know how to stay productive? Britain is quite competitive, but we have a very poor productivity rate compared to other countries. We're not doing enough to understand why and put it right. So I think there's something really important about engaging research to look at scenarios, look at possible shocks, and get ahead of the curve. I read the congressional report on national competitiveness, which is a few years old now, but I thought more reports like that are probably the way you deal with the sorts of issues you mentioned.
Gentleman on the left.
Yeah, Ambassador, you started out by talking about trade, and trade is, I guess, capital is mobile, labor is much less mobile. So within a country like the United States, you might have seen manufacturing move from the north to the south. Folks who needed jobs from the north, where their factories moved south, had the ability to move if they wanted to. And also there was I think, a shared sense of interest among Americans sort of generally. And so the country was able to figure out how to deal with that. When you get to globalization and jobs move from America to lower cost places, China, India, the developing world, you no longer have that shared sense of interest. So while capital has benefited from that by being able to access lower cost labor, the average American worker hasn't benefited from that. So this move towards populism and maybe against globalization is understandable. How do you go about protecting this liberal international trade order when at the very heart of it is really a shifting? The world has benefited, right? More people have been lifted out of poverty than ever before, but that has not benefited America. It's benefited the world. And since people look at things nationally, how do you protect that international trade order?
Wow, there's a lot there. First of all, I'd say America has benefited, but not all Americans have benefited, which I think is fair. Partly America benefits because it has the ideas, it creates iPhones, it assembles them somewhere, so the jobs shift, but a lot of money comes back to America, not least because you have one of the most vicious tax collecting systems in the world, because all Americans are taxed. So some of the benefit comes back to America. I think that's point one. I think some of the answer is the same to the gentleman. It's incumbent on governments to get ahead of the economic curves and to try to do more to anticipate where these shifts will occur, because they will occur. You can't stop them, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But what you can do is ensure people are trained for different roles, different jobs, and you can continue to put money into science so that you can innovate and create new products and new ways of doing services which contribute to the economy. Very interestingly, the European Union, amazingly, does have free movement of labour, totally free movement of labour. Looked at from a single market point of view, that's one of its strengths. It happens to be the part that has been most difficult for Britain and led to Brexit. But as a single market, it actually functions reasonably efficiently, and I would argue probably better than the single market that's continental USA. But I think the reason I think populism is understandable but not excusable, if you're people out in West Virginia and you're poor and you live in a trailer and you shop at Walmart, the very people who shop at Walmart, who support populist policies of the president and others, if the tariffs on goods come in, those people will be paying 25% more at Walmart, and that's not going to help them. There's something interesting about populism in the way we're using the term, about people are voting with their emotions. They're not voting in line with a rational calculation of their own economic interests. And I think it's incumbent on commentators, academic institutions like this one, writers like you, to keep illuminating how you make a rational calculation and how you get away from decisions based on emotion.
Part of what's pernicious about populism is that populists are often reacting to anger that's very well-grounded and well-founded, and that has deep reasons, but they don't actually address those reasons. I think we have time for one last question from the lady over there, and then unfortunately, the ambassador has to go and do unimportant things
Libya.
like figuring out what's going on in Libya. So,
well, thank you very much for answering this last question. I just wanted to highlight that I think quite often academics and policymakers will ignore some of the benefits we've seen from populism, higher levels of political engagement and participation, particularly from those who kind of were left behind and disenfranchised in the low rates of participation we'd seen in some democracies. And really, this participation is what many of the democracies are founded on. And I just wanted to ask, what does politics look like in which we can reap the benefits of kind of a populist engagement without having the negative consequences?
Wow. Well, looked at like that. I mean, you're right, we've used populism in a wholly negative sense today. And to be absolutely honest, I would always think of it like that. But I think what you're getting at is a kind of direct democracy that flows from things like social media, from the way citizens can participate in so many things at once. And the danger there, I think, is how do you ensure that people get information they need in order to thrive. I know I'm speaking to an audience that doesn't believe in big government, but if you take health issues, if you take something like the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, some very poor quality information got out that vaccine as a whole was unsafe. That turns out to be untrue. But the effects of that false information continue to feed a frenzy on the internet, and George Washington University believes that's been exploited by the Russians. So while completely agreeing with you that the fact that there's this direct Athenian-style direct democracy for the ordinary person because they have access to lots of things, at some point there has to be a way of communicating to people how they can best look after themselves. And I don't think we've quite found the route to that yet.
Well, I think I personally have found it very heartening to see that there are still some adults in the room and that they think very carefully and deeply about these topics. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.